year 1957 will long be remembered as Hillsboro's sesquicentennial year. On August 27, 1807, David Hayes made a plat of the town, and on September 7, 1807, he received a deed for 200 acres of land from Benjamin Ellicott for the payment of $100. The plan of the new town of Hillsboro, adopted by Hayes, who himself was a surveyor, was worthy of the tastes and intelligence of present-day planning. The two principal streets, Main and High, were laid off 99 feet wide. All others were 66. Alleys were 16 1/2 feet, and the in-lots were 99 feet front by 198 feet back. Almost all the in-lots were within the boundaries of North, East, South, and West streets. The present-day visitor to Hillsboro is immediately impressed by the beauty of Hillsboro's shady streets and many stately homes. Some of these houses are the Sig Mullinex and Donald Durnell homes on North High, the old Ottowill house on East Walnut. On East North Street, a modest frame house was the birthplace of cartoonist Milton Caniff. The Frank Collins residence on East Walnut, home of Dr. Jim Williams. The Richard Ferris house on Southwest Street. The Russell Lowell home on West North. The Harry Ludwig residence on West Pleasant. In one of the newer sections of Hillsboro are these houses on the Danville Pike. Across the street we see the homes of John Banyas and Charles Limes. The Ralph Pence house on North High was the old Dawson home. The Roger Griffith home was the Dr. Larkin place. In 1957, officials of the city of Hillsboro were Bill Woolard, police chief, Matthew Crabtree, safety director, Mayor Carl Dobley, and Fire Bennett. 3 members of the fire department are Robert McLaughlin, assistant fire chief, Jack Zink, and Orvie Harshbarger. Other firemen, Elwood Wilkin, John McCrite, Bob Barger. Bob Runyon, Charles McCrite waving the red flag, Dave Hyam, Francis Stevens, Ralph Rogers, and Ledger McConaughey. Three members of the police department are Hubert Saunders, Tom Doherty, and Special Patrolman Roger Ports. Sheriff Walt Riffett and Police Chief Bill Woolard. Two members of City Council, John Tom and Ed Faring. The new Webster School was opened for use in 1955. The old building, seen in the process of being torn down, dated back to 1867. Washington School was opened in 1896. The remodeled Washington building was reopened January 1957. The present high school building was opened for use on January 13, 1936. The Hillsborough High School Band, directed by Mr. George C. Miller. On June 4, 1877, Town Council passed a 1/2 mil levy for library purposes. A reading room was opened in City Hall building. The library moved to the old Samuel P. Scott home, its present location, in 1948. The Highland County Courthouse is one of the oldest in the state of Ohio. The foundation was laid in 1832 and the building was completed in 1835. The Sesquicentennial Week opened with a community vesper service Sunday evening, July the 14th, 1957. Ministers participating were Reverend Billy Lucas, Reverend Lester Harbold, Reverend Scott Westerman, and Dr. Paul Jones. Governor C. William O'Neill was the principal speaker for the service. In contrast to 20th century styles of dress, beards and bonnets were the order of the day. Concession booths and rides were erected in the business district. Hillsborough's younger citizens enjoyed the Sesquicentennial as much as anybody. contest on the platform in the background was one of the highlights of the celebration. Ayers Drugstore. The huge mortar and pestle erected in 1876 are still seen in front of the oldest drugstore in Ohio. Mr. Edwin B. Ayers, Jr., owner. Pest shop. Mr. and Ms. Jack Miller. Sug Stanforth's restaurant. Fetro's Ladies Wear. Mrs. Harold Fetro on the left, Mr. Harold Fetro on right. Moore's Store, managed by Bill Case and B. Harris. Tom's Studio, owner John Tom on the left. Organized in 1826. The oldest dry goods store west of the Allegheny, operated by Frank Zane and Catherine Granger. Betty's Hat Shop, Mrs. Betty Swartz, owner. Hilliard's Men's Store, Lyman Hilliard, owner, on left. C&W Shoe Store, Joe Carlisle, manager, in the center. Mayroy's Restaurant, Mrs. Mary Wishelm, owner, in the center. Pence Sewing Machine. Collins Appliance, Frank Collins, owner, on the left. Duffy's Paint Store, Mrs. Duffy, proprietress. Shaw's Shoe Shop, operated by Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Webster. Dr. J.P. Moran, Dr. Moran in doorway. Boone's Service Station, George Boone, owner. Dickerson's Restaurant. Owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Dick Dickerson. Reed's Drugstore, Mr. and Mrs. Homer Reed on the right. Gordon's Auto Supply Company, the Gordon family in this picture. Paul's Exchange Store, Paul and Vera Klein, owners. Henry's Shoe Store, Harold Henry, owner, in the center. The City Loan. Jim Bird, manager. Duncanson Brothers. Guy Duncanson, owner, on the left. Kelly's Service Station. On the left, Jim Kelly, owner. Ellison Brothers, Glenn and Charlie, owners, on the right. Penquite's Food Market. Penquite family in this picture. Port's Drug Store. Mr. and Mrs. Gail Port's, owners. Schaefer's Supermarket. Art Miller, manager. Hillsboro Dry Goods Store. Mr. Stevens, manager. Owned and operated by Litt Brothers. Day's Service Station. Owner, Bert Day. D.M. Evans Furniture Company. Dave Evans and Albert Chief Toll. Owens Market, owned and operated by Mr. D.H. Owens. Hillsboro Publishing Company, H.C. Barnes, owner. Kaufman's. Lester Myers, owner. Fairley's Hardware Store. Vernon Fairley, owner, second from left. Banyas Buick. Owned and operated by John Banyas in the center. Patrolman Shoemaker has just placed a ticket on the car of Mr. C.F. Millies. Matson's. Owned and operated by Jack Matson on the right. Dairy Queen. Mr. and Mrs. Howard Ellis, owners. Stockwell's Furniture Store. Dick Starbuck, owner. Buck's Garage. Jim Buck on the right. Dr. William L. Lukens, veterinarian. The Lukens family in this picture. Hillsboro TV and Communications, and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Leslie George. Hatchery, Barry, owner. Summers Sunoco Station, Frank Summers, owner and operator on the left. Whistler's Grain and Feed, Raymond Jones, owner. Siders Auto and Home Supply, Mr. and Mrs. Virgil Sparky Siders. Hillsborough Bank and Savings Company, Vernon Fairley, president. Merchants Bank, Mr. J. Ed Shannon, president. Lang's Smokery, Mr. and Mrs. George Pierce, owners, on the right. Hillsborough Farmers Exchange, Mrs. May Means, owner, Charles Roslow, manager. Sanderson Leather Shop, Mrs. Carrie Sanderson, owner. Ellis Furniture Store, Elmer Ellis and daughter. Abe's Used Cars, Delman Aber, owner. Highlander Restaurant, home of fine food. Mr. and Mrs. Gil Cantor, managers. McGee's Restaurant. Operated by Mr. Denver McGee. Lehman's Realty, Virginia and Orrin Lehman on the left. Dunnick's Wholesale, George and Neoma Dunnick. Western Auto Supply, operated by Mr. and Mrs. Don Guthrie. Elberfelds, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Elberfeld and family. Litt Brothers. Mr. and Mrs. Lou Jacobs on the left. Goodwill Industry, Guy Mallory, manager. George R. Steele Realty Company, Mr. Steele on the left. And in Sam's Implement Company, Donald and Norval Sams, owners and operators. Wilkin Insurance, John, Blangy, and Henry. Rooney's Taxi. Miss Doris Rooney, owner, on the right. Dobley's Tailor Shop. This is a picture of the Dobley family. Booth's Novelty Shop, owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Booth. Chatterbox Restaurant, operated by Naomi and Tootie Kratzer. McGee's Bakery, Mr. and Mrs. Lyle McGee, operators. Byrne and Milligan. H.R. Milligan, owner. Tot and Teen, operated by Mrs. Lillian Rutledge, Jane Stanforth. Model Dry Cleaners, Al Richards, owner. Automotive Service and Supply, operated by Art Phillips and Charles Barger.
Sesquicentennial pageant, the Golden Years, was presented on 4 nights during the week of the Sesqui. Here we see Bill Fowle and art teacher Virginia Morris working on the backdrop for the pageant. Mrs. Gladys Wessels directed the cast of hundreds, and Leslie George served as narrator. Miss Helen Ross was the queen of the Sesquicentennial. Her attendants were Mary Ann Witt, Kay Patton, Barbara Butler, and Nancy Stanforth. Big parade formed at the Highland County Fairgrounds. The parade lasted the better part of a hot July afternoon. Dr. W.M. Hoyt, president of the Sesquicentennial Corporation, and Mr. Frank Collins was honorary president. Mrs. W.M. Hoyt, secretary. Mrs. Owen Lehman was the treasurer. Fire Chief Fred Bennett served as general chairman for the Sesquicentennial. parade, those who survived the heat of the day went on to enjoy the rest of the festivities. A cabin on the courthouse square where visitors of the Sesquicentennial registered and souvenirs were sold. One of the features of the Sesquicentennial was the exhibit of the work of Milton Caniff, famous cartoonist and native of Hillsboro. This is the Church of Christ and Christian Union on Northwest Street. The Bethany EUB Church, built in 1902. The First Baptist Church was erected in 1906. The New Hope Baptist Church, located on East Beach Street. The Church of the Nazarene, also on East Beach Street. The Church of the Christian Science is located at the corner of West and Walnut Streets. The Wesleyan Methodist Church was built in 1874. The First Presbyterian Church, the present building, dedicated in 1899. The Park Avenue Church of Christ at the corner of Park Avenue and Southwest Street. The Wayman Chapel AME Church was built in 1880. The First Methodist Church, erected in 1853. St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church, dedicated in 1853. The Hillsboro Church of Christ. This building was built in 1915. The St. Mary's Episcopal Church, built in 1855. Sunset Motel, owned and operated by Mr. Edwin Booth. Wilman Service Station. Mr. James Wilman on the left. Gable House Antiques. Owned and operated by Mrs. Leah Rood on the right, with other members of the Rood family. Mr. Lionel Rhodes, proprietor. The Cheney Fuel Company. Owned and operated by Mr. Norman Cheney Sr. on the left and Norman Cheney on the right. Dodge Service Station. Norman Ludwig, owner. Stevens Antique. Mr. and Mrs. Eskel Stevens, owners. H.S. Manker Plumbing and Heating. Harley Manker, owner. The G.C. Murphy Company. Leroy Pa, manager. The Thamia Store, managed by Mr. George Armentrout. The Highland County Movers, owned and operated by Mr. Joseph H. Leverton. The Columbus and Southern Ohio Electric Company, Mr. Al Helrick, manager. The Moon Tractor Company, Mr. Jim Moon, owner and operator. The Sherman-Williams Paint Store, Mr. Roger Griffith, manager. This is a train display in the window of Klein's store. A room in the armory, antique furniture furnished by Mrs. Donald Durnell. Another room in the armory, table settings belonging to Mrs. Donald Durnell. The office of Mr. Gerald M. Lucas, dentist. The Hillsborough Lumber Company. Owned and operated by Mr. L.G. Barker and son Robert. Penn's Bar and Grill. Owned and operated by Mr. James Penn. Brown's Body Shop. Bob Brown on the left and John Brown on the right. The Hillsborough Auto Company. Earl Robinson and Mr. William Nye, owners. Evans Funeral Home. Mr. Albert Toll left, Mr. David Evans right. The Hillsborough Dry Cleaners, owned and operated by Frank and Clarence Burkett. The Ramsden Plumbing and Heating Company. Owned and operated by Mr. James Ramsden Sr., right, and son Russell left. Finance Company. Mr. Bill Kennedy, manager, on the left. On the right. The Turner Miller Funeral Home. Owned and operated by Mr. Hope Miller on the left and Mr. Bill Turner on the right. Harsher Cemetery Memorials. Mr. Paul Harsher on the left and his son Charles on the right. The Highland Producers Association. Mr. Bill Cornelius, manager, second from left. M&M Distributing Company. Mr. and Mrs. Fred C. Millies, owners. Mr. Dick Ferris, general manager. Watson's Tavern. Bell's Foundry, founded in 1858 by Mr. C.S. Bell. Now owned and operated by Virginia and Charles Bell. Johnny's Bargain Center. Mr. John Morris, Jr., owner. Holiday Brothers. On the left of the picture, Mr. Lewis and Larry Holiday. Wilkin Heating. Mr. Paul Wilkin, owner, on right. F.E. Zane and Sons. Mr. Louis Zane, manager, on the right. Kramer's Grocery. Owners, Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Kramer, on the left. The Hill City Hotel. Alber's Supermarket. Glenn Wright, manager, on the right. Coal and Supply. Owned and operated by Mr. Elmer Vogel in the center. Kelcher's Grocery. Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Kelch and family. Cook's Convalescent Haven. Operated by Mrs. Conetta Cook, second from the right. The Gulf Station, North High. Mr. Fred Kraft, manager, on the left. The Sinclair Bulk Plant. Mr. Herschel Murphy, agent, on the right. The Franklin Brothers Welding, operated by James and Ralph Franklin on the left. The S&W Garage, Woodrow Whalen and Bob Skelton, Blair's and Sons, Mr. Pliny Blair, owner, on the left. Jean's Flowers, Mrs. Jean Head, owner, on the right. The Pure Oil Bulk Plant. Glenn Griffith, manager, on the left. The Hillsborough Business Bureau, operated by Ann Dwyer, center. The Shell Bulk Plant, Mr. Gene Chinkle and Mr. Murphy, co-agents. The North End Grocery, owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Denver Moberly. The Maine's Tin Shop. Mr. Clyde Maines, owner, on the left. Dr. Walter Fenner, veterinarian. Hell's Automotive, owned and operated by Chester and Harold Shelton. Tractor and Implement Company. Mr. Paul Birch, owner, on the left. Treat Drive-In. Mr. Carlos Barrett, owner, on the right. Nolan's Radio Service. Mr. Nolan Zarnes, owner. Gas service station. Owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Homer Gas. City Service Bulk Plant. Mr. Joe Frump, manager, on the right. Hillsborough Monument Company. Mr. Harold Lemon, owner, on the left. Radio station WSRW, operated by Mr. and Mrs. Dave Winslow, on the right. The Inter-County Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Mr. Charles Hills, manager, second from left. This property was once the C.S. Bell property. The Ohio Asphaltic Limestone Company. Mr. Bill Mason, manager, kneeling.
Hall, and Mr. B.R. River, president of Farmers and Traders Bank. Cooper's Carryout, owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Frank Cooper. Acro Manufacturing Company. Mr. Primo Pavoni, manager, second from left, and other company executives. Following are scenes of Acro's plant operation. and Company Investments. Operated by Mr. and Mrs. Neville Fairley. Highland County Acceptance Company. Bill Redkey, manager. Davis, Law Office. Mr. Richard L. Davis, Highland County Prosecuting Attorney. Donald E. Fender, Real Estate Office. Mrs. Donald Fender. And Mr. Donald E. Fender. Swanger Dairy. Ronald E. Swanger, owner, on left. Following are scenes taken of the milk processing. Farm Bureau Cooperative. Donald Cox, manager, second from right. Transportation Company. Heber Duckwall, owner. Office of Dr. Lena Holliday. Dr. Holliday on the left. Dr. Roy Rogers Jr., DDS, on the right. His father, Dr. Roy Rogers Sr., in the center. The office of Dutch Hilliard Insurance. Dutch Hilliard, owner. Bernadine's Beauty Shop, operated by Bernadine Menzler. Farm Dairy. Jim Patton, owner, reading gauges. Laverne's Beauty Shop, owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Eddie Kerr on the right. Office of Dr. James Williams, optometrist. Dr. James Williams' family. White's Foundry. John Lucas, owner. Old Bookstore, owned and operated by V.D. Christoffel, second from left. Murphy Benham Hardware Company, owned by T.F. Barker, managed by Dale Balzer. These are scenes from the children's parade. Sears Supermarket. Donovan Hawk, manager, on the left. Lime's Jewelry Store. Charles Lime's owner. The offices of Cheney Insurance Agency. Owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Jack Cheney. Baker Auto Sales. E.C. Baker, owner. Ralph Henselman's Tire Service. Gross Feibel Company. Scotty's Cafe. Ab Beatty, owner. Highland Enterprise Lumber Company. Mr. C.E. Tucker, owner. Tasty Boy Drive-In. Fraternal Order of Eagles Lodge Hall. Hawaiian Bar. Western and Southern Life Insurance Office Building. Greystone Motel, operated by Mr. and Mrs. Pryor Link. As the Sesquicentennial, many young people of the community reveled in removing their fathers' beards. As Jim Bird Jr. is doing in this picture. These are views of cleaning up after the close of the Sesquicentennial. See you in the year 2007 for the bicentennial. Bye.